Hello everyone, welcome back to our GRE series. I'm Eli Andy, a GRE instructor here at the International Scholars Program. So today we'll be looking at a few strategies you can use when answering data interpretation questions in the GRE. As we realize, the GRE has a different type of question and question formats and topics, and all these different things require different approaches relevant to them. And so for today, let's look at some of the things you need to keep in mind while practicing your data interpretation questions while preparing for the GRE. So the first thing we need to know is that in the GRE, data interpretation does not really test your memory or rote learning. Basically, it's not how much you remember from your studies that data interpretation questions will test you on. Unlike maybe other topics in the GRE like algebra or arithmetic, where you'll be required to know some specific things. For example, it pays in algebra to know that if you want to calculate 100 squared minus 99 squared, then you can treat this as a difference of 2 squares and equate it to 100 plus 99 into 100 minus 99, the difference of 2 squares. So this is something you need to know for algebra. But when it comes to data interpretation questions, you don't have to worry about knowing some specific topics or subtopics. So if it doesn't test your memory or how much you have crammed from your studies, then what does data interpretation test? Now, basically in the GRE, data interpretation questions will test your understanding and extrapolating abilities. That is when you're presented with dense data. Can you go through the data, understand what is being asked or what the data is saying? And can you use that data to make some logical conclusions? Actually, the math itself when it comes to data interpretation, the math itself is in most cases rather straightforward. You'll be dealing with maybe arithmetic, some addition, some multiplications, squaring here and there. But it is your understanding and the breakdown of the information presented that data interpretation questions really test. So how do we prepare for these questions? The first thing, of course, is to get familiar with the different formats of data interpretations. Pie charts, column charts, line graphs, for example, these are some of the most common data interpretation formats in the GRE. So you need to know how to read them. For example, when you are given a pie chart, you need to know that maybe a rough, simple example here will surface. When you have a pie chart, for example, like this, and we have A, B, C. Even without looking at the percentage for C, because pie charts are drawn to scale, you should know that C will have the biggest percentage, whatever they are measuring here. So you need to know how to read pie charts, column charts, line graphs, and so on. Those are fundamental skills for data interpretation questions in the GRE. Then when it comes to the question itself, you need to study the diagram, whether it's the chart or a graph, study it before reading the question. Now, we point this out because many people, because you understand the GRE is time sensitive, so people usually rush to the questions and start answering, maybe even before understanding what the question is all about. That kind of approach especially is not good at all. It's even worse for data interpretation questions where you are dealing with dense materials, lots of data and numbers that you need to make sense of first. So study the diagram and see what it has, what it means, the information it explicitly states, because that will help you, like we said, to extrapolate some logical conclusions from the data. Then you also need to focus or pay attention to the units, quantity, scale, and even the labeling of the X and Y axis. And maybe this forms part of the previous step that you need to study the question table first. Like, look at this chart we have on the screen, where we have the y-axis, of course, is the vertical one, and you have the x-axis, the horizontal. So in the x-axis, we have the brands A, B, C, D, E, and T. And this chart is dealing with clothing store sales by brand in 2015. So in the x-axis, we have the brands, and in the y-axis, we have the sales. So for example, for brand E, you can see that the sales were 300. The sales were 300 in 2015, right? Wrong. Take a look at this chart again. The sales for brand E in 2015 was not 300. Rather, it was 300,000. Because we are given this information here in brackets that the sales are given in thousands of dollars. So brand E actually was $300,000. So if you were not keen enough, then you might be tempted to use maybe $300 for brand E, and that would be wrong. So pay attention to the units, the quantities, scale, and the access. Every information given here is relevant. Don't overlook anything.
You are watching Success with Bob Mwiti Show, presented to you by the International Scholars Program. The International Scholars Program is an award-winning international education financing scheme that helps bright students to pursue graduate studies abroad regardless of their financial background. You can find our programs by going to www.internationalscholarsprogram.com. The International Scholars Program, empowering dreams.
Yes, and maybe this, we have here another chart that can also help us understand why we need to pay attention to everything when it comes to data interpretation charts. Like here, take a few seconds to study this chart. Okay, so I believe you have seen what it's talking about in the y and x-axis, the units, and so on. And that brings us to this point. Don't confuse percentages, rates, proportions, and actual numbers. Now, this is a tip that applies to all GRE quant questions, but we point it out here because not most, but rather many questions will be featuring percentages, rates, or proportions. And knowing the percentage, the rate, or the proportion of something does not mean that you know the actual numbers. Consider a car yard, for example, that sells different makes of vehicles, and you are given that the ratio of convertibles to SUVs is in 2 to 3. What this ratio tells you is basically that for the relationship between convertibles and SUVs can be given by this ratio. For every 2 convertibles in the yard, we have 3 SUVs. But you actually don't know the number of the convertibles and SUVs in the yard. So you don't confuse these ratios, rates, proportions, and actual numbers. And coming back to this chart, look at the x-axis, where we have the number of calories burned per hour. In the y-axis, we have the different types of activities. So if you were to pick, for example, this value here represents 1,000 calories burned per hour. And that means, for example, if you are handling or tackling a question based on this chart, you'd be wise to keep in mind that it is not 1,000 calories total, but 1,000 calories burned per hour. So for someone who may be engaged in an activity that burns 1,000 calories per hour, but they only engage in that activity for 30 minutes, their total calories burned would be half of 1,000. So again, pay attention to percentages, rates, proportions, and don't confuse them with actual numbers. And one last one to illustrate this point, which is very critical. We have this one here, where it's a chart of gross federal debt as a percent of gross domestic product for the years 1940 through 2010. So in the x-axis, we have the years, and in the y-axis, we have the percentages. So what we have in the y-axis is the percentage that represent the gross federal debt compared to the gross domestic product. So it's like a proportion. Okay, so if we were to pick, for example, this reading here, we have, it reads 60%. So it means in this year, the gross federal debt was 60% of the gross domestic product. So if the gross domestic product, for example, okay, so maybe just a note here, we have, if we have the percentage as 60%, then it means for that year, if the gross domestic product, that is the GDP, if the GDP was 100 million, then the gross federal debt would be 60% of that, and that would be 60 million. So again, you can see the need to understand percentages, rates, and proportions when it comes to data interpretation questions in the GRE. Then another thing is that you don't always need to work out your answers to the last decimal point. And you don't always need to work with extremely accurate numbers when it comes to data interpretation. The thing is, the GRE provides calculators for test takers, but too much use of the calculator can be time wasting, especially for questions where the calculator use is unnecessary. For questions where you can actually approximate, you don't always have to run to the calculator. So for example, in this question, we have answer choices ranging from 7.5 to 27. These choices are not that close. And that maybe brings us to another point, that look at the answer choices first before you decide whether to approximate your calculations or deal with the actual numbers. Like for this example, say your analysis had led you to conclude that the answer is something above 20% or something at least 20%. So if you have that conclusion in mind and you have these answer choices, then you automatically know that choice A, B, and C are out. So you are looking at choice D and E, 22 and 27.5%. These numbers are far enough apart that you don't need, for example, to get this 0.5. If you are to do the calculation, for example, with approximation and get something like 27, then that would be good enough because that would lead you to E. So know when to approximate and also know when you need to do the calculation using the actual numbers. And lastly, you can take notes. As we've seen, some of these charts in data interpretation questions have lots of information. And keeping track of that information in your head maybe can be a bit risky depending on what you are used to. And because you'll have rough work and a marker in the test, just jot some things down so that when you are doing your calculations, you work with the accurate info. And remember, lots of practice will help you to cement these things in your brain. The more you practice with these strategies, the more you will become better at them and you will improve your data interpretation capabilities. So that brings us to the end of our GRE session today. I hope you've learned something. But for more in-depth look at GRE Quant, I welcome you to join the International Scholars Program, where we have a professionally run GRE training program. Bye.